The chandeliers of the Devonshire Winter Ball glowed like 1,000 captured stars, scattering gold across silk gowns and polished marble. The air was heavy with perfume and pretense, with laughter that cut like crystal. It was the height of the London season, the time when names were traded like currency and beauty was a weapon sharper than wit. And somewhere, amid the glitter and noise, stood Clara Whitmore, quiet, modest, and painfully aware that she did not belong. Her gown was lavender satin, simply made but clean, altered by her own hands with careful stitches. Her stepmother had called it adequate. Her stepsister, Lydia, had called it embarrassing. The women around her glimmered with jewels like small suns, while Clara's only adornment was a ribbon at her throat, pale blue, faded from years of careful keeping. It had belonged to her mother. She had come because her stepmother insisted, declaring, "Even a plain girl might attract pity if she stands still enough." The words had stung, but Clara had gone anyway, because she still held a tiny ember of hope, the foolish human hope that someone might look past the surface and see her. The orchestra played a waltz that seemed to carry the whole room. Lydia twirled past, laughing in the arms of a viscount, her skirts sweeping like lilac mist. Clara lingered by the edge of the dance floor, clutching her fan as though it could make her invisible. "Miss Whitmore?" A young gentleman, flushed from champagne, bowed mockingly before her. "Would you honor me with a dance?" For a moment, joy sparked in her chest. Of course," she began. But his friend laughed behind him. "Good Lord, James, you'll frighten the poor girl. Don't jest so cruelly." The first man smirked. "Plain girls should learn to laugh at themselves, don't you think?" The laughter that followed was polite, sharp, and utterly devastating. Clara froze. She could feel the heat crawl up her neck, the air closing around her like glass. Before tears could betray her, she turned and walked, steady, quiet, refusing to let them see her break. Out on the terrace, the night air was cold and clean. Snow had begun to fall in delicate flakes, melting against her bare shoulders. She leaned on the marble railing and closed her eyes. Inside, the violins swelled again, a song for the beautiful and beloved. She, it seemed, was neither. "How strange," she murmured to the dark, "that a heart can feel so full and yet so invisible." A voice answered, low and steady from the shadows. "Perhaps it is the world that is blind, not you that is unseen." She turned sharply. A man stood a few paces away, half hidden by the colonnade. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in black. A mask of dark velvet covered his eyes and the bridge of his nose, its edges lined with silver thread. Beneath it, his mouth curved in a faint, almost sorrowful smile. "Forgive me," he said, inclining his head. "I didn't mean to intrude. I only thought no one should cry alone at a ball." "I'm not crying," she said quickly, though her voice betrayed her. "Then the snow is weeping for you," he replied softly. She blinked, startled into silence. No one had ever spoken to her like that, with kindness untainted by pity. He stepped closer, his gloved hands clasped behind his back. "You're not like the others. You don't chase the light, but somehow it finds you." "You're mistaken," she whispered. "I have no light." The masked man tilted his head. "Then perhaps I see what others do not." For a long moment, neither spoke. The snow fell around them in soft spirals, each flake catching the faint glow of the ballroom lanterns. "May I know your name?" she asked finally. He hesitated. "Names are dangerous things. They make promises I can't yet keep." She frowned. "Then what shall I call you?" He thought for a moment, then said simply, "A man who prefers to see with his heart." Clara's lips parted, unsure whether to laugh or weep. "Then I suppose I should thank you, sir, for seeing me at all." He gave a small bow. "And I for finding something worth seeing." Before she could reply, the ballroom doors opened, and a rush of light and laughter spilled out. She turned toward it instinctively, but when she looked back, the masked man was gone. Only the faint outline of footprints in the snow remained, leading toward the dark gardens beyond. And though she told herself not to be foolish, that such encounters were made for fairy tales, something within her whispered that she had just met the beginning of hers. The next morning, the world awoke to gossip. Every drawing room in London whispered of the masked Duke of Evermere, the enigmatic nobleman who had appeared at the Devonshire ball. He had danced with no one, spoken little, and vanished before midnight. Some said he was hideously scarred, others that he was mad. But one rumor spread more quietly, that he had been seen speaking with a girl no one remembered seeing before. That girl, of course, was Clara Whitmore. She sat by her bedroom window, the city stretched gray and glistening below. In her lap rested a cup of untouched tea, gone cold long ago. Every sound from the streets, carriage wheels, vendors calling, felt far away, muffled by her thoughts. Had she dreamed it? The man with the mask, the voice that cut through humiliation like light through fog? No, she decided. She had not dreamed it. The memory was too alive. The sound of his voice, the weight of his words. Perhaps it is the world that is blind, not you that is unseen. The words echoed in her chest long after the snow outside had melted. At luncheon, her stepmother prattled on about suitors and scandals, blissfully unaware that her stepdaughter's heart was wandering somewhere far beyond the parlor. Lydia, radiant and cruel, waved her fan lazily. "You did speak to someone last night, didn't you, Clara?" she teased. "Some poor soul too polite to walk away?" Clara ignored her, her cheeks warm. "Oh, don't look so offended," Lydia continued, laughing. "It's almost admirable that you try. But really, darling, it's best you stop reaching for things above your station." Her stepmother tittered in agreement, slicing into a pear. "She's right, my dear. You are simple. It's not an insult, merely truth." Clara set down her fork gently. "Then I hope one day truth finds better manners." She rose, excused herself, and left the room before either could reply. That evening, unable to sit still, she walked to Hyde Park, where the last of the snow clung to the edges of the pond. The city's lamps shimmered on the icy surface. Somewhere, distant laughter drifted from a passing carriage, and then, that same voice. "You shouldn't walk alone at dusk, Miss Whitmore. The world grows crueler when it thinks no one is watching." Her breath caught. She turned, and there he was. He wore the same dark coat, the same mask that gleamed faintly beneath the lamplight. Only now she could see more, the sharp line of his jaw, the silver at his cuff, the faint fatigue in his posture. "Do you follow all plain girls?" she asked softly, "or only the ones you pity?" The masked man chuckled, the sound low and warm. "Pity? No. Curiosity, perhaps." "Curiosity," she echoed. "That's a dangerous thing in London." "So is honesty," he said. They began to walk, slow and unhurried, their breath visible in the cold air. The park was empty, save for the wind and the whisper of branches overhead. "You vanished last night," she said finally, without a word. "I feared if I stayed, the night would become something it shouldn't. And what would that be?" "Kind," he said simply. She smiled in spite of herself. "Kindness frightens you. It's harder to survive than cruelty. Cruelty I understand." Something in his tone, quiet, self-mocking, full of history, made her chest tighten. She wanted to ask why, but the way he looked at the frozen pond made her hold her tongue. After a long silence, she asked instead, "Why the mask?" He hesitated, then said, "Because it spares me from the world's eyes, and the world from mine." "That's not an answer." "No," he admitted. "It's a truth I'm not ready to explain." The wind tugged at her ribbon, the pale blue one at her throat. It fluttered toward him, and without thinking, he caught it between his gloved fingers. He looked at it for a long moment, then handed it back. "Keep it," he said softly. "There are too few things in this world that are simple and honest." Their eyes met, hers bright with quiet wonder, his shadowed behind the mask, and for a moment it felt as though time itself had stopped to listen. "Will I see you again?" she asked before she could stop herself. He looked away toward the darkening path. "If fate allows." "Do you believe in fate?" He turned back, the faintest smile touching his lips. "I do now." And with that, he bowed, turned, and disappeared into the fog rolling off the lake, leaving her standing alone, her heart alight with a warmth that the cold could not touch. That night, when she lay awake in her narrow bed, the words came back to her again and again. "I do now." She pressed a hand to her chest and whispered into the dark, "Then perhaps, so do I." For days after that evening in Hyde Park, Clara Whitmore found herself listening for footsteps that never came. Every creak of the garden gate, every rustle at the door made her pulse quicken, foolishly, hopefully, yet the man with the mask did not return. She told herself to forget him. He was a nobleman, or at least someone of rank. His manner, his speech, the effortless way he carried command in silence. Whatever his reason for seeking her out, it could not end well. And yet, his words lingered like a song half remembered. You don't chase the light, but somehow it finds you. It was a dangerous thing, to be remembered by a stranger's kindness. It made one's heart betray reason. A week later, her stepmother received an invitation, a rare and dazzling honor, to dine at Evermere Hall, the estate of the reclusive Duke of Evermere, recently returned from abroad. Society had long whispered about him, that he'd been wounded in war, that he'd killed a man in a duel, that he lived hidden by shadows and servants. An opportunity, her stepmother announced with the smug delight of a woman already imagining the gossip. Lydia will attend, of course. The Duke may be a ghost, but ghosts still have fortunes. You, Clara, will remain home. Clara bowed her head in quiet obedience, though a strange tremor stirred in her chest. The Duke of Evermere. That name had followed the same whispers as the masked Duke. Could it be? No, she told herself. It was madness. But when evening fell and the carriage departed with her stepmother and sister, curiosity overcame caution. She slipped outside into the night, her cloak drawn tight, and walked the winding lane until she reached the hill overlooking Evermere Hall. It was a vast, brooding structure, its towers clawing at the winter sky, its windows dim except for one faint light on the upper floor. The sound of the sea rolled faintly below, and in the distance, the faint notes of a piano carried on the wind. Her breath caught. The melody, low, hesitant, mournful, was the same tune he had hummed that night in the park when he thought she wasn't listening. She was still standing there, heart pounding, when a voice behind her said softly, "I thought curiosity was dangerous in London." Clara whirled, her cloak whipping in the cold. He was there, the masked man, closer than she'd ever seen him, the moonlight glinting off, the silver threads of his mask. "Then perhaps I've decided to be brave," she said quietly. Something like amusement or admiration flickered in his eyes. "Bravery often disguises loneliness," he murmured. "Which are you tonight?" She hesitated. "Both, perhaps." The faintest smile touched his lips. "Then we are the same." He stepped closer, and she could see now that beneath the fine coat and gloves there was weariness, the weight of someone who had fought not just battles of war, but of heart. "Why hide here?" she asked, "in a house full of silence?" "Because silence does not judge," he said, "and the world outside does." He turned away, staring toward the sea. "I wasn't always this way. Once I thought myself invincible. I rode into battle for king and country, proud, reckless. And then, the cannon fire, the smoke, the screams." His voice faltered. "When I woke, I was told I lived, but that my face did not." Clara's breath caught. "Your scars." He looked at her then, and for a heartbeat she thought he might lift the mask, but instead he said softly, "They remind me daily of what I lost, and of what no one must see again." Her voice was barely a whisper. "And yet you came to the ball." "Because I had to remember what living felt like, even if it meant being among those who would recoil." "They didn't all recoil," she said gently. "One didn't." Something fragile flickered in his eyes, a light that trembled between disbelief and yearning. "Why are you here, Clara Whitmore?" he asked. She hesitated, unsure herself. "Perhaps because someone once told me I had light, and I wanted to know if he still believed that." Silence. Then, a breath of laughter, quiet and raw. "God help me," he murmured, "but I do." They stood there beneath the winter moon, neither daring to step closer, yet unable to look away. The cold air carried the sound of the sea between them, vast, endless, like the distance between two wounded hearts that somehow recognized each other. At last he said, "You should go. People will talk if they see you here." "I don't care," she whispered. "But I do." His tone softened. "For your sake, not mine." He took her hand, briefly, gently, and pressed something into her palm. When she looked down, she saw a small pendant of black glass, glimmering faintly with silver dust. "Keep it," he said. "It once belonged to someone who believed beauty could be found even in broken things." When she looked up again, he was already walking back toward the great doors of Evermere Hall. The wind caught her hair, the snow began to fall, and in that fleeting instant, Clara knew. She had just seen the heart of the man behind the mask, and for the first time, she did not pity him. She loved him. "Would you like me to continue with paragraph 4? The Duke's secret portrait, 700 words. Next." You said, "Yes," ChatGPT said, "Wonderful." Now the story turns deeper. Secrets begin to unfold inside the grand shadowed halls of Evermere. The masked Duke's grief and self-exile meet Clara's quiet courage, and love starts to bloom where neither expected it. Days passed, yet the memory of that night haunted Clara like a whispered dream she could neither keep nor forget. Each dawn she told herself it was over, that she would never see him again. Each dusk, her eyes drifted toward the hill above the city where Evermere Hall stood watching the world, its windows dark as unread eyes. But fate, it seemed, had decided otherwise. A week later, a sealed envelope arrived at her home. Her stepmother nearly fainted when she saw the wax crest pressed into the parchment, a raven entwined with a silver crown. "The Duke of Evermere requests your presence," her stepmother breathed, eyes glimmering with greed. "Good Lord, Clara, what have you done?" Clara's hands trembled as she opened the letter. The handwriting was precise, elegant, yet the words carried a quiet urgency. "Miss Whitmore, I owe you an apology, and perhaps a confession. If you are willing to hear both, come to Evermere at dusk. A.B." Her stepmother, oblivious to the trembling of Clara's hands, immediately began planning gowns and jewelry, but Clara shook her head. "The invitation is for me alone," she said firmly. "The seal says so." That evening, dressed in nothing more than a simple gray cloak and her mother's blue ribbon, Clara arrived at Evermere Hall once more. Mrs. Latham, the Duke's housekeeper, a tall, severe woman with kind eyes, led her through long corridors lined with oil portraits. The air smelled faintly of dust and cedar. Every step echoed softly as if the house itself were holding its breath. "He waits in the East Gallery," the housekeeper said. "But, Miss Whitmore, mind what you say. His Grace has not allowed company, least of all ladies, in that room for many years." Clara nodded, unsure what awaited her. When she entered the gallery, she understood. It was vast and dimly lit, the windows shrouded with heavy curtains. The only light came from the fireplace and the golden lamps that cast soft halos across the marble floor. Portraits covered the walls, generations of Evermere nobility, all proud and cold-eyed. But one painting drew her gaze immediately. It stood at the far end of the room, taller than any other, covered with a black velvet cloth. The Duke stood beside it, masked, still, though the firelight softened the edges of the darkness that clung to him. "You came," he said quietly. "I wasn't certain you would." "I had questions," Clara replied, "and you said you owed me truth." He inclined his head. "Then truth you shall have." He turned toward the veiled portrait and hesitated, just a heartbeat, before pulling the cloth away. The canvas revealed a woman. Her face was delicate, almost ethereal. Her gown of crimson silk shimmered like wine in candlelight, but her eyes were hollow, sad, and hauntingly familiar. Clara gasped. "She looks like you," he finished softly. "Yes. Her name was Isolde Fairborn. She was once promised to me." He stared at the portrait, his voice low. "She died 3 years ago, the night before our wedding. She couldn't bear the idea of marrying a man who'd returned from war broken, scarred, they said, inside and out. The carriage overturned on the cliffs. They said it was an accident. I have never believed that." Clara's heart tightened. "I'm so sorry." He gave a bitter smile. "Do you see now why I wear this mask? Because it was never just my face that was ruined. It was the part of me that trusted love could be anything but cruel." For a long moment there was only the crackle of the fire and the slow rhythmic fall of his breathing. Clara stepped closer, her voice trembling. "And yet you still came to the ball." "Because I was tired of ghosts," he said. "And then you appeared, standing alone yet unbroken. They mocked you. But you did not shrink. You reminded me of what I once believed love could be. Her heart ached at his words, at the fragile honesty behind them. You're wrong, she whispered. You are not ruined. He turned sharply. You've not seen my face. I've seen your soul, she said. The words hung between them, alive and dangerous. He exhaled, slow and uneven. You speak as though the heart matters more than beauty. Perhaps that's because I've never had beauty to hide behind, she said gently. For a moment, he seemed on the verge of reaching for her, his hand lifted, trembling, but he stopped himself, retreating into the safety of shadow. Go now, Clara, he said quietly, before I forget why I should let you. She wanted to argue, to stay, but something in his voice, fragile, almost pleading, held her still. Instead, she looked once more at the portrait, then at him. I'll go, she said, but I'll come back, because you shouldn't have to face your ghosts alone. When she left, he stood motionless before the fire, the velvet cloth fallen at his feet. He looked up at Isolde's painted face, then down at the small handprint Clara had left upon the gallery door. And for the first time in years, the Duke of Evermere felt the stirrings of something that frightened him far more than pain. Hope. In the days that followed, Clara Whitmore returned to Evermere Hall under the quiet pretense of helping the housekeeper with correspondence. No one questioned it, not even the Duke, though his eyes always betrayed that he knew. The great halls of Evermere, once silent as tombs, began to stir again. Curtains were drawn open to let in pale sunlight. The scent of dust faded beneath the fragrance of polished wood and winter roses. Servants whispered that something had changed, that the manor breathed again. But only Clara knew why. Every afternoon, she found herself in the East Gallery, where the fire never seemed to go out. Sometimes the Duke would join her, standing by the tall windows, speaking little. He never removed his mask, but his silences were no longer cold. They were full of thought, of memory, of something reaching toward warmth. One evening, as the sun burned red across the horizon, Clara noticed the grand piano in the corner of the room, a magnificent instrument draped with a thick layer of dust. "Does no one play it?" she asked softly. The Duke stiffened. "Not anymore." "Why not?" "Because the last song it played was for a woman who never finished it." She turned toward him gently. "Then perhaps it's time someone did." His jaw tightened beneath the mask. "You do not understand what music does here. It unearths ghosts better left buried." "And yet," she said, "ghosts only fade when they're finally heard." For a long time he said nothing. Then, almost despite himself, he gestured toward the piano. "If you must." Clara approached it like one would approach a sleeping creature. She lifted the lid, the faint scent of old wood and ivory rising with the dust. Her hands hovered uncertainly above the keys. She began to play her mother's lullaby, slow, soft, a melody simple enough for a child, but deep enough for a wounded heart. The notes wandered through the gallery, delicate and trembling, weaving themselves around portraits and shadows alike. The Duke did not move. He only listened. The music touched the cold edges of his memory. The night his fiancée's carriage disappeared into the storm, the echo of her laughter mingling with thunder. For years he had shut out all sound, fearing that beauty itself had betrayed him. But now, this melody, this humble, fragile song, filled the silence not with pain, but with something achingly alive. When the final note faded, he spoke, his voice almost a whisper. "What was that?" "A song my mother used to play," Clara said. "She said it was written for those who lost someone they loved, to remind them that love doesn't end, it only changes its shape." The Duke's throat tightened. "Do you truly believe that?" "I must," she said simply. "It's the only way I've survived." He turned away, hiding whatever emotion might have escaped. "You risk much by bringing life back into this house." "Then perhaps life deserves a little risk," she said, smiling faintly. That evening, long after she left, he returned to the piano. His hand hovered over the keys, trembling. The mask felt heavier than usual, pressing against the part of him that ached to breathe. Tentatively, he pressed a single note, then another. It was clumsy, uneven, but when the sound echoed through the room, it didn't hurt. It healed. The servants passing outside paused. For the first time in years, music lived within the walls of Evermere. From that night on, Clara visited daily. Sometimes she read aloud from her worn books. Sometimes she spoke of her late mother's teachings, of how kindness was not weakness, but courage. And sometimes she simply played while he listened, his gloved hands resting quietly on the piano lid, his silence a form of gratitude. It was not love yet, not fully. It was something gentler, like the first thaw of spring beneath layers of snow, quiet, unseen but unstoppable. One evening, as she prepared to leave, he spoke suddenly. "Clara." She turned, surprised. He rarely used her name aloud. "Do you not fear me?" he asked. She shook her head. "I fear what loneliness does to a soul, not the scars it leaves behind." He looked at her for a long moment, the firelight reflecting in the dark glass of his mask. "You see too much." "Only what you let me see," she replied. He smiled then, a real, unguarded smile, faint but unmistakable. "Then I must be careful what I allow." She met his gaze with quiet defiance. "Or you could allow the truth." That night, after she was gone, he stood before the mirror in his chamber. His reflection was a stranger, half man, half shadow. Slowly, with trembling fingers, he lifted the mask just enough to meet his own eyes. For the first time in 3 years, he did not turn away. Spring crept slowly across the cliffs of Evermere. The frost withdrew from the gardens, and tiny buds of wild roses began to appear along the stone walls, timid, as though uncertain whether they were allowed to bloom. So too did something fragile begin to bloom within Duke Adrian Blackwell, though he scarcely dared to name it. He had grown used to Clara's presence, the soft rhythm of her footsteps echoing through the halls, the faint scent of lavender she carried with her. He told himself her company was merely a balm for loneliness, that her music was a gentle reminder of what peace once felt like. But the truth ran deeper, sharper, frighteningly alive. He found himself watching for her shadow beneath the library door, listening for the sound of her laughter in the courtyard. When she was late, he felt an unease that both warmed and terrified him. And yet, the mask remained. It was his prison and his shield. Behind it, he could be anyone, a man untouched by pity, a duke who commanded respect instead of whispers. But each time Clara's eyes met his, he felt the weight of it grow heavier, as if her kindness might see right through it. One afternoon, as a storm gathered over the moors, Clara arrived soaked from rain. Her cloak clung to her shoulders, her cheeks flushed with cold. "You shouldn't have come in this weather," Adrian said, crossing the room quickly. "The road from town floods easily." "And leave you to your ghosts?" she teased gently. "I think they'd grow far too bold without supervision." A reluctant smile tugged at his lips. "I've told you before, Miss Whitmore, you are far too impertinent for a governess." "Then you should dismiss me," she said, setting down her satchel. "But you won't." His breath caught. She was right. He couldn't. Lightning flared across the windows, followed by a crack of thunder that seemed to shake the whole house. Clara flinched slightly, and without thinking, Adrian reached out, his gloved hand brushing her wrist. The contact was brief but electric. She looked up, startled, and for the first time saw the man beneath the mask in his eyes, not the Duke, not the recluse, but someone lost, searching, afraid to be seen. "Adrian," she began softly. It was the first time she had ever spoken his name. He froze. "Say that again." She hesitated. "Adrian." It broke something in him, not painfully, but like the sound of a lock giving way after years of rust. "Clara," he said quietly, "you don't understand what you do to me." She stepped closer, her voice low. "Then help me understand." He turned away, struggling. The storm outside raged louder, mirroring the one within him. "You think this is simple. That kindness can undo years of bitterness. You think love can make me whole again, but you don't know what I've become." "Then show me," she said. Her words fell into the silence like a challenge and a prayer all at once. Slowly, with trembling hands, he reached up and undid the clasp of his mask. It fell to the floor with a soft, hollow sound. Clara drew in a breath, not of fear, but of sorrow. His face was marked by deep scars running from temple to jaw, the cruel work of battle and fire. Yet his eyes, those piercing gray-blue eyes, held the same quiet gentleness that had always undone her. "Now you see," he whispered. "This is the man the world calls a monster." She stepped closer. "No, this is the man I've been speaking to all along." He shook his head. "Do you not see the horror of it, the reason I hide?" "I see the strength," she said, tears welling. "I see a man who has suffered and still knows compassion. I see the face of courage." Adrian's composure broke. He sank to his knees, hands covering his face, as though ashamed even of her mercy. "Don't," he said hoarsely. "Don't look at me like that. You'll make me believe I deserve it." Clara knelt before him, her hands gently removing his from his face. "Then believe it," she whispered. The storm howled outside. Thunder rolled across the cliffs, but within the east gallery there was only stillness. Two souls, one broken, one brave, bound together in the quiet defiance of tenderness. When the rain subsided and the fire burned low, Adrian rose and turned away, his back to her. "You've seen what I swore no one would see again. I don't know whether to thank you or curse you for it." "Then perhaps do neither," Clara said softly. "Simply live." He looked at her over his shoulder, something unreadable flickering in his gaze. "You make that sound possible." "It is," she said, smiling faintly, "if you let it be." He said nothing, but when she left that evening, the mask remained where it had fallen, and for the first time, the Duke of Evermare did not pick it up again. It began with whispers. At first, they were faint, rippling through drawing rooms, fluttering behind fans, carried by servants who thought their words harmless. But gossip, like wildfire, never asks permission before it burns. By the end of the week, all of London society was talking about the Duke of Evermare, the scarred recluse, the fallen hero, who had, they said, taken up with a common governess. When Clara Whitmore arrived at the marketplace that Friday morning, the stairs followed her like shadows. Women she had once greeted with polite smiles now turned their backs. A group of young men, dressed in fine coats and cruel grins, murmured as she passed. "Poor thing," one said loudly. "She must have some hold over him. No other explanation for a duke to notice that." Her hands clenched around her basket, but she kept walking. She learned long ago that dignity, when silence failed, was a weapon of its own. Still, the words pierced. That evening, when she returned to Evermere Hall, Adrian noticed the faint redness in her eyes. He said nothing at first, only poured her a cup of tea, his movements slow and deliberate, as though afraid his own anger might spill. "They've begun talking, haven't they?" he said finally. She nodded. "It doesn't matter." He looked up sharply. "It does. Words wound deeper than swords, Clara." "They only wound if we let them," she said, her voice soft but steady. He set the cup down. "You are far too brave for a world that does not deserve it." "Then let me be brave for both of us," she said simply. He turned toward the fire, his face shadowed by the flickering light. "You don't understand how cruel this world can be. I've seen men smile as they destroy another's honor. I won't have them destroy yours because of me." "You don't destroy my honor," she said, stepping closer. "You give it meaning." His breath caught, that quiet, aching sound between disbelief and longing. But before he could speak, the doors burst open. Mrs. Latham, the housekeeper, hurried in, her expression pale and grim. "Your Grace," she said breathlessly, "Lady Fairborn has arrived." Clara froze. "Lady Fairborn?" Adrian's voice was low, controlled. "Isolde's sister," Mrs. Latham nodded. "She insists on seeing you." Moments later, Lady Arabella Fairborn swept into the room, tall, elegant, and wrapped in the kind of beauty that drew both admiration and danger. Her eyes, sharp as cut glass, flicked immediately to Clara. "So it's true," she said coolly. "You've taken to keeping servants as company, Adrian. How charitable." Clara stiffened, but the Duke's tone was cold steel. "You will not speak to her that way." Arabella's smile was thin. "I only wonder what my sister would think, to see you throwing away your dignity on a nobody." Clara's heart lurched, but before she could speak, Adrian rose from his chair, his height and authority filling the room. "Enough. You came here for gossip, not truth. If my choices offend you, then be offended elsewhere." Arabella's gaze hardened. "You think this farce will last? The world will eat you alive, Adrian, and her with you." When she swept out, the silence left behind was heavy and cruel. Clara turned away, her voice trembling. She's right. The world won't forgive you for this. He crossed the room in 2 strides, taking her hand. Let them judge. I lived half my life behind a mask, not to hide from scars, but from people like her. I will not live that way again. Tears shimmered in Clara's eyes. And me? What if they drag my name through mud? What if... Then I will stand beside you, he said fiercely. Every cruel word will fall against both of us, but I swear none will touch your worth. She looked up at him, trembling, caught between fear and the warmth of belief. Adrian, he cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing away a tear. You once told me ghosts only fade when they're heard. Let them hear us, Clara. Let the world see that I am not ashamed. Outside, the storm clouds that had lingered for weeks finally began to part, letting the faint light of dawn spill across the moors. And within the halls of Evermere, where whispers had once ruled, a new sound was born, quiet, defiant, and impossibly strong. Hope. The invitation arrived like a dare. The Marchioness of Wycliffe's spring ball, the grandest event of the season, attended by every name worth uttering in London society, had extended a personal card to the Duke of Evermere. It was embossed in gold, sealed in wax, and delivered with the polite cruelty of a summons. Adrian turned it over in his gloved hands, the weight of it far heavier than paper should ever be. They mean to parade me, he said bitterly. The disgraced Duke and his scandalous companion, a spectacle for their amusement. Clara stood by the window, looking out at the gray morning beyond the glass. Then let them watch, she said quietly. If you stay away, they win. They get to keep their story, that you're ashamed, that I don't exist. He looked at her, at the calm fire in her eyes, and for a moment he saw the courage he had lost years ago, staring back at him in its purest form. Do you truly wish to face them? He asked softly. I wish, she said, for you to live without fear. And so, 1 week later, Evermere's carriage rolled into the courtyard of Wycliffe Hall, beneath a sky heavy with awe. Starlight? The air was crisp, alive with the hum of violins and gossip. Every head turned as the great doors opened. The Duke of Evermere entered, tall, scarred, unmasked. Gasps rippled through the ballroom like wind through reeds. Conversations halted. Fans fluttered in frozen hands. On his arm walked Clara Whitmore, simple gown of ivory silk, no jewels but a single blue ribbon at her throat. Yet somehow she outshone every diamond there. Her quiet grace, her steady gaze, they burned brighter than finery ever could. The orchestra faltered, uncertain whether to continue. The Marchioness herself stepped forward, her practiced smile tight. Your Grace, she said sweetly, London is most pleased to see you among us once more. Adrian inclined his head. And I am pleased to remind London that monsters do not hide forever. A ripple of uneasy laughter swept through the crowd. The Marchioness blinked, then turned her attention, like a knife, toward Clara. And your companion? Clara opened her mouth to speak, but Adrian's voice came first, steady, clear, commanding. Miss Clara Whitmore, the woman who restored life to Evermere Hall and to me. Whispers burst like sparks through the ballroom. He's lost his mind. A servant, plain as porridge, how absurd. Through it all, Clara stood straight, her hand trembling faintly on Adrian's arm, until he leaned closer and whispered, Look at me. Only me. She did. And in that moment, the laughter faded, the whispers dulled, and the world became only the two of them. The orchestra began to play again, a waltz, slow and deliberate. Adrian turned to her and extended his hand. Will you dance with me? Her heart leapt. Here? Now? Now, he said simply, and so they did. The Duke and the governess moved across the marble floor, their steps perfectly in time, as if they had been meant to find each other in this single defiant moment. Every pair of eyes in the room followed them, some with shock, some with pity, and a few, perhaps, with envy. As the music swelled, Clara realized something extraordinary. She was not ashamed. She did not care that her gown was simple, that her family had mocked her, that society sneered. The only truth that mattered was the warmth of his hand, the steadiness of his gaze, and the love that needed no permission. When the song ended, silence filled the room. Then, from somewhere near the back, an old gentleman began to clap. Slowly, others followed, hesitant at first, then stronger, until the applause rolled like thunder. Not everyone joined in, but enough did to make her eyes sting. The Marchioness, forced into politeness, curtsied. "A beautiful performance, Your Grace." Adrian's voice was calm, but his words cut clean through the noise. It was not a performance, it was proof that scars, seen or unseen, do not make one unworthy of love. He turned to Clara then, his tone soft, but certain. "You once told me ghosts fade when they're heard. Tonight, I think we've silenced mine." Her eyes shimmered. "And perhaps mine too." He lifted her hand, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. Around them, the ballroom, that gilded temple of judgment, seemed smaller, dimmer, while the world between them glowed. That night, when they left Wycliffe Hall, the sky had begun to snow again, silent, pure, forgiving. And for the first time in years, the Duke of Evermere smiled without hesitation, because love, once whispered, had finally spoken aloud. The morning after the ball, Evermere Hall felt different. The servants moved lighter, the windows stood open to the pale spring air, and the walls, which had held their silence for years, seemed to hum faintly with life again. News of the Duke's return to society had spread like wildfire, but so too had whispers of the dance. People could not agree on what they had seen, a scandal, a tragedy, or something braver than either. For Clara Whitmore, however, the noise of London no longer mattered. She found peace in the quiet corners of the estate, in the gardens that bloomed beneath the cliffs, in the way the sea wind carried the scent of salt and new beginnings. She often played the piano in the East Gallery now, unafraid, filling the grand old house with sound. Adrian listened often, though he no longer hid behind walls or masks. He would stand by the window, arms folded, gaze fixed on the horizon. His scars, once the chains of his solitude, had become part of him, not shame, but history. That afternoon, she found him there, staring out toward the sea. "You've been thinking again," she said gently. He smiled faintly. "You make it sound like a crime. Only when you forget to share your thoughts." He turned, and for a moment she saw not the Duke, but simply the man, weary, hopeful, deeply human. "I was thinking," he said slowly, "that I spent years believing life was a punishment, that love was something cruel, a promise made only to break you. But last night, when they looked at us and I didn't care, I realized I was wrong." Clara's breath caught, but she said nothing. He stepped closer, every word deliberate. "You didn't save me, Clara. You reminded me I could save myself, that I could still be the man my father raised, the man I lost in war." She felt tears sting her eyes, but she smiled through them. "And you reminded me that I could be seen, and still be enough." They stood in silence for a long moment. Then he took her hand and led her down the garden path, through rows of ash trees that whispered with the wind. The sky was a pale blue, the kind that promised rain but offered peace first. Beneath the largest tree, where wildflowers had begun to bloom, Adrian stopped. "This place," he said quietly, "was once my mother's favorite. She used to say ash trees were for strength and endurance, that their roots ran deep enough to survive any storm." He turned to her, his voice soft. "I think she would have liked you." Clara laughed lightly, wiping a tear. "I think I would have liked her too." Adrian reached into his coat and drew out something small, a ring, simple but elegant, set with a sapphire the color of twilight. It caught the light and glowed faintly, as if holding a piece of the sea. "I don't have speeches," he said. "I don't have the right words to make promises the way poets do. But I have this." He took her hand, the same hand that had first played music in his silence, the same hand that had steadied him through storms, and went down on one knee. Clara gasped softly, the world tilting around her. "Clara Whitmore," he said, voice low, trembling only once. "You've seen every broken part of me, the scars, the anger, the cowardice, and you stayed. You loved me not as a duke, not as a man who could offer you the world, but as one who needed a reason to keep it. So now I ask, will you give me yours? Will you be my reason, my peace, my duchess?" Her hands covered her mouth. Tears spilled freely down her cheeks, but her smile was radiant, fierce, alive. "Yes," she whispered. Then, louder, with the strength of every moment that had led her here, "Yes, Adrian, 1,000 times, yes." He rose, slipping the ring onto her finger, and when their lips met, it wasn't the grand, fevered passion of fairy tales. It was something gentler, a sigh of relief, a homecoming long overdue. The wind rustled through the ash leaves above, and a petal drifted down, landing between them like a benediction. He rested his forehead against hers and whispered, "I was never meant to be saved, was I?" She smiled. "No, you were meant to be loved." And in that quiet clearing, surrounded by the hum of the living earth, the Duke of Evermere knelt not in shame, but in devotion, to the woman who had seen his soul and called it beautiful. Years passed, as quietly and beautifully as the turning of pages in a cherished book. Evermere Hall, once cold and silent, had become a place of light. Where dust once gathered on the marble floors, now laughter echoed. Where portraits of proud ancestors had stared in judgment, now sunlight spilled freely across the frames. In the East Gallery, the room where ghosts had once lived, stood a piano gleaming like new. Its keys had been polished smooth by years of music, its sound no longer mournful but alive. Clara played there often, her fingers moving with the calm grace of a woman who had found her home. Sometimes her melody was soft like the whisper of the sea, sometimes bright like birds in early spring, but always beneath every note there lived the quiet strength of her love, the love that had rebuilt a life once buried beneath loss. The Duke, Adrian Blackwell, her husband, her equal, would listen from the doorway, a faint smile tracing his lips. His scars, though time had softened them, remained, not as reminders of what he had suffered, but of what he had survived. He no longer hid from the world. He hosted guests again, scholars, veterans, poets, men and women who sought warmth in his company rather than fear in his silence. Children ran through the corridors, their laughter trailing like ribbons through the air. Some called him the kind Duke, others the brave one. But to Clara he was simply Adrian, the man who had once been lost to darkness and who had chosen to live again. One spring morning, as the cliffs bloomed with wild violets, Clara sat by the open window, the sea wind tousling her hair. The scent of salt and roses mingled in the air. She hummed as she played, her mother's lullaby, the song that had first reached the Duke through the stillness of grief so many years ago. Adrian approached quietly, carrying a small wooden box. Inside lay the broken black glass pendant he had once given her. It had cracked long ago, the night he threw away his mask, but he had kept it still. "I thought it time this was mended," he said softly. Clara smiled, tracing the repaired seam of silver that now bound the pendant together. "You fixed it," he nodded. "Or perhaps it fixed me." They stood together, gazing out over the cliffs where the waves struck white against stone, relentless, eternal. The world, they had learned, was not kind, but it was capable of redemption. "Do you ever miss the man you were?" she asked. He took her hand. "No, because he wouldn't have known how to love you." She turned, tears glimmering in her eyes, and kissed him, slow, deep, without need for words. Later that evening, as twilight painted the sky in strokes of rose and gold, the villagers gathered outside the manor. Music drifted from the open windows, not somber hymns or formal waltzes, but songs full of laughter and warmth. For the first time in generations, Evermere Hall had opened its doors for a celebration not of lineage or wealth, but of life. Inside, Clara sat at the piano, surrounded by friends and family. Adrian stood beside her, one hand resting lightly on her shoulder. When she began to play the old lullaby again, he joined her, his deeper chords blending with hers in perfect harmony. And as the final note faded into the air, the guests fell silent, not out of decorum, but reverence, for they could feel it too, the peace that had settled here, the love that had once been impossible, now made eternal. Outside, the ash trees swayed gently in the night breeze, their leaves whispering the story that would outlive them all. A story of a broken duke who had feared love, and the plain girl who taught him that love was never something to fear, only something to finally believe in. And when the moon rose over Evermere that night, It shone on two figures by the open window, a man and a woman, scarred yet whole, silent yet understood. And the faint sound of a lullaby carried once more over the cliffs, the song of Evermere,